Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today on our episode. And so, could you start off this episode by introducing yourself and talking about your journey in becoming a licensed mental health therapist?
Yeah, I would love to do that. So my name's Dr. Monica. I'm a trauma therapist in Washington, D.C., and I own a group practice. And I call myself a trauma therapist because I offer something called EMDR. It's an acronym for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And essentially, that is one of many tools and techniques that therapists use to help people somatically. So, what that means is sort of in the body, right? Processing sort of the residue that trauma can leave behind. Um, that can be anything from an acute one-off traumatic event, say like an accident, or it could even be something compounding, right? If we think about another acronym, CPTSD or complex PTSD, these are folks who experience throughout their life and often during their developmental or formative years some attachment-related trauma, so trauma with parents or caregivers. And so those are the folks I primarily work with, and that's what I do day to day. But how I got there, to answer your other part of the question, um, and to think through a short answer on this one, I think it comes down to the word representation. I think growing up, I never met a therapist who looked like me. And just for reference, because folks are probably listening in and they don't see me, I am of Chinese descent and I think it's gotten better. I'm hopeful that new generations of therapists are leaning in to their own cultural identities and heritages and really expressing themselves. But when I was coming up at school, when I needed help, there was little to no representation. So I think that's one of the many reasons I really felt compelled to enter the mental health profession was to be one of now many who represent our communities, our collective communities. And it's been great. I love being a therapist and I recommend it to anyone who's thinking about a career in therapy. We need you. We need more of us.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I've definitely seen like an increase in representation in like Asian American like mental health therapists and also just like in memoirs, like a lot of Asian Americans have written about like their mental health in memoirs like the Joy Luck Club or like Crying in H Mart. So yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
I
You're
agree.
listing some great books. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So since you are a trauma-informed therapist, could you maybe explain what this approach is and why it's so meaningful to you?
Yeah, actually, this ties into my earlier answer about representation because I surprisingly or unsurprisingly, work then with a lot of people who look like us, who are of mixed heritage or who are of Asian descent. And we grew up in cultures where English for many of us was not our parents or caregivers' first language or our elders' first language. And there's something to be said about less relying on talk therapy in English and more about somatic, and again, I'm using that word, but sort of bodily work, right? So a holistic approach to mental health care. And so when I think about trauma, what I ultimately mean is how can I work with understanding what's happening to one's body when they have gone through such serious stress and where do they hold that? And I think other professions do this well in different ways. I mean, you have acupuncturists and massage therapists. And I don't know about you, but I saw my grandma doing Tai Chi in her backyard often. And I'm sure there was a lot to that. And so there are so many ways to heal and I just happened to choose this one. And so when I think about trauma, it's really about how can I also work with your body as well as talk through, right? Blend the two and talk through some of the issues that someone's dealing with. Yeah. Did that answer your question? I hope.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh,
Thank
great.
you so much for introducing yourself.
Of
So, as you
course.
know, like this episode is going to be on like Asian culture and its influence on mental
Mhm.
health. So, to
Yeah.
start off, could you explain what filial piety is and how the
Mhm.
concept influences mental health in Asian families?
Oh yeah, this is a great question, by the way. So thank you for creating it, for bringing it up. I think for people and your listeners who have never heard of the word or phrase filial piety before, maybe we'll just start with sort of a definition, a very short one, of course. I mean, if you were really interested in this, I'm sure you could really dig into the history. But filial piety essentially is a concept, it's a virtue really that came originally from Confucianist ideas. So there's a lot of spirituality and religiosity sort of mixed in with the way this virtue was created. But I think present day 2025, it still exists, but in more subtle ways. So even if your parents or caregivers are not Confucianists per se, the long lasting effect of understanding um, how to love and respect your and devote yourself to your elders, your parents, and your ancestors is really what this virtue is about. So it's really a guiding framework for children and even adults. We're all adults here, but we'll always be children to our parents, I guess, is the idea of it. So it requires children to provide care and support and obedience to our parents. I see you both smiling a bit because that resonates, right? And I feel that too. Um, so the idea stems from being obedient and honoring our elders. And, it was originally created or a virtue sort of stemming from, as I said, Confucianist ideas and Chinese heritage. And you see them often in East Asian values, but listeners listening to your podcast, I mean, there are different ways this shows up in the structure of Asian families, regardless. So it may not be labeled as filial piety, but I imagine a lot of people can relate to the idea, maybe even the pressure of feeling like we need to be obedient and think about sort of the collective or what our parents think out of sort of respect for them, right? That's how it's kind of packaged um, over our own, individual desires and ideas. And so that's a little bit about what it is. And I started to share a little bit about how it shows up today. Um, but I'm so curious to know if you have any particular questions within that or if something came up for you when I said that.
I guess like you talked about how East Asian families have this thing to be respecting their elders. Like, do you see this culture also in, I guess, more Western societies, or is it just limited to East Asian families?
That's a great question. I do think it's more, it depends on where you're positioned, but I do think from an Eastern perspective, yes, I do see it more with Eastern versus sort of westernized Western families. And I'll tell you why. I think there's a collective um, caring. It's not all bad. I think it's a collective caring and sort of, and even survival, right? For our communities, that's very protective in the way that we think is sort of in consideration or sort of over consideration sometimes for others. Whereas Western philosophy is very centered on individual pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And you could go back and forth about which one's better or worse, but to be completely neutral, I think they both can have, right, some strong benefits. So I see this often, or sort of this conflict in therapy with my clients when, let's say, they want to pursue a type of career or even pursue a degree that uh, their parents really, I think some of it's from a misunderstanding, like just genuinely don't understand. And then also, I think there's a thing that happens in collectivist cultures where they all sort of exchange notes, say, with their neighbors or their other relatives or extended family, and they compare and sometimes create competition amongst young people, what is your child doing? Oh, mine's going to med school. Oh, mine's I see. I think I'm catching that, right? Like
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely
it
at like
happens. Yeah.
family reunions and stuff. That that definitely happens. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And there's more to say about that, but I'd love to hear if you have another question and happy to expand on it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that like especially like from like our school, I think a lot of us come from like immigrant families, and this also adds on to like the pressure of like doing well and getting a degree that will like end up like benefiting you and your family. So like I was like
Hmm.
wondering, like how this pressure is impacting like the mental health of like the youth of today.
Yes. So there's a few different ways that I see that happening. I'll start with just the relational piece, which is, I think, at its worst, again, this is worst case scenario, I caveat it with that, but I think young people have a really hard time of feeling misunderstood by their parents, not being heard, right? And not only are they feeling perhaps even guilty or even ashamed of wanting something different because they do understand the pressure, they do understand the sacrifice, but they're not receiving the validation that they so want and the encouragement that they really need to pursue their passions. And so I that's one way is that I can see it really disrupting communication and sort of a sense of love between, parents and students or young people. Um, but I'll step back to tell you that like having I've had sessions with both parents and young people, and I will tell you, it's a wild ride. What I will tell you though is that to have a little empathy, I should say, when I have a little empathy about whether it's my own parents or witnessing other parents express kind of their very kind of almost rigid viewpoints about like, well, what is success? How do you define success? Success is in like I'm going to use the example earlier, becoming a doctor. If you think about it, a lot of immigrant parents believe in the American dream, right? Believe in this. It's called meritocracy, which is essentially a fancy word for merit-based promotion, social, right, standing, right? That if I achieve the things that I want, then I can be what I want. And honestly, a degree, a job, a paycheck, these are all quantifiable things to success, right? They're all like numbers and things you can point to. And so I think for those reasons, it's really hard for immigrant parents to conceptualize, well, if you say you both take a unconventional path, you kind of go this way and try out a few different things and things your parents never even imagined. Well, the unimaginable feels really unsafe, right? It feels unknown and it feels like, well, if something goes wrong, I can't protect you, right? I don't know that route. And so for those reasons, I think I have a lot of empathy for I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying I have a lot of empathy for parents who are immigrants because they really do measure success in one individual way, whereas I think my generation and your generation who's younger can expand, right? We have a lot more resource, and you could argue sort of privilege to kind of think creatively about how we can go about things. I mean, I don't even know if my mom still understands what I do for a living, which is okay. She's like, you talk to people and they help, anywho. So that's a big sort of way I see young people, it affecting young people. And sometimes it gets the best of us, and we negotiate authenticity for love, right? We want to please our parents, and we do the ultimate sacrifice by perhaps exchanging what we want for maybe what they want to make us proud. And sometimes we can find satisfaction in that. It's not all or nothing. We can pursue a path that, say, someone guides us on and find satisfaction in it. Other times we achieve the thing and we're at the top of the mountain and we're looking around like, I don't know, I thought this would be better than I thought. I thought this is what I was told I wanted, but maybe it's not what I really wanted. And so it can feel sad too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I really agree with what you said about how our different generations have a different definition of success, and also like how basically if you're not like on the path or if you like make a mistake, it's really hard to like correct. So I was wondering, when do you think that like this concept of filial piety kind of becomes like harmful in families?
Mm, yeah, that's a good one. Let me pause for a moment. When does it really become harmful? Okay, there it's going to be a complex answer, but I think bear with me. I think there's a few ways this can kind of go wrong. And I was alluding to it a little bit, but there's a
Mhm.
little more steps in between. When someone is at a pivotal point to decide to make a decision about their life, sometimes they can confuse what they want with what someone else wants. Sometimes we can even kind of like gaslight ourselves to thinking like we actually want what our parents or whomever wants. And we don't really give it much thought. We don't really give it much, we don't try anything new. We become really risk averse and we almost stop thinking for ourselves, right? And and this is where things can come awry because then we can create sort of this codependency, right? Where we can't make decisions for ourselves to an extreme point of having to depend on, say, our parents or whomever. I interchange caregivers because I know not everyone maybe listening has parents or identifies with having parents, but um, and so this is where I think the danger can really occur. Oops, my monitor phone. The danger can really occur, which is I have a hard time making decisions, even the smallest ones for myself, because I'm so used to defaulting that to someone else, and someone else may know better than me. And I can't trust myself any longer. And that can be really hard to like rebuild some self-trust.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's definitely like really interesting, especially because like in Asian cultures, like if you live with your parents, it's kind of like normalized. And then in America, if you're like living with your parents after college, it's like you're like, oh, why are you not independent yet? Yeah.
Oh, I know. Let me normalize this for your listeners. And it's tradition to your point. I lived with my parents till I got married, which is very kind of typical, right? But not for a lot of my other friends who moved out immediately, like even after high school. And it was just different. There are a lot of other factors, resources, otherwise opportunity, but I think ultimately, yeah, there's a difference there and feeling sort of it could be seen as dependent or sort of like you're one step behind socially because there's a hard time kind of keeping up with the kind of freedom that maybe we notice other people have because we have cautious parents who survived quite a bit and they may be traumatized themselves. So all they're doing is trying to keep us safe, but in doing so, we can ultimately internalize that and become scared of of taking chances and risks too. Yeah.
Yeah, so talking about that, I think you spoke a little bit about like trauma from our parents. So like what is intergenerational trauma and how does it affect like Asian or minority communities?
Yeah. So intergenerational trauma, it's a word that we're hearing a lot more, isn't it?
Hmm.
Isn't that amazing? When did I'd be happy to answer your question, but I'm just kind of having a conversation here. I'm so curious when you all first heard the word, or if you like read it, so like, where did you read it? Where did you hear it? Did you notice like more socials talking about it? Like, when did you first learn about it?
I think for me, it was just like on social media, like when I was like a little
Yeah.
younger. I think that like social media is like this like more like open forum where like more teens can like communicate about like what they're thinking. And I think that a lot of like teens, especially in like minority communities, are just starting to like realize like the amount of like trauma that their parents have experienced and how they pass it on to them through like their, I guess, their parenting style or like the way they like responded to people's behaviors. And so that's just how
Mhm.
I finally like realized that that was something that children were facing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me, it was kind of, it was not so early on. I think I actually kind of realized it like last year because in school, basically, we did a unit on like culture and identity. And so we were reading like a lot of memoirs and like watching, wait, I don't know if you guys did the unit, but we watched like movies about like culture and stuff like that. And so a lot of that was exploring kind of like that intergenerational trauma. So that's kind of when I got exposed to it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And this is probably where, is this the course where you read Crying in H Mart or where
Oh
you
no.
watched the Joy Luck Club? Oh, is this something
It was
separate? I was about to say it's a
I
good
read that
memoir.
after. But
Okay.
we read like short excerpts like like a Kurt Cobain one, and
Oh, yeah.
we watched
Hmm.
like Minari and stuff like that.
Yeah. Wow. I want to take this course. This sounds fun. Um, yeah, I think there's two things I want to bring up when it comes to intergenerational trauma. And I think you all did such a beautiful job describing it in your own way as well. And it essentially is that. It's the trauma in our body that is transmitted generationally. And like I said at the top of our time, there's a bodily and genetic component to this too. And so that's where talk therapy, and what I mean by that is predominantly based in spoken word, can kind of feel limiting because we may need to take a more holistic approach. But that aside, intergenerational trauma is really an interrogation of what are an immediate interrogation and often like a systemic. So we're thinking outward, right? We're thinking like generations prior. This is really interesting though, because I don't know about you, but a lot of parents, whether English is their first language or not, a lot of parents do not share what they've gone through. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes they didn't have the privilege to speak up, sometimes because of the surveillance culture or oppression that they came from. Like it just is literally dangerous to speak your mind and say your piece and to explore your emotions. And sometimes they didn't have the language or the models to do it. There's many reasons why stories don't get passed down. So I think our generations, mine and yours, are doing what we can with our own privilege to try to put the pieces together, even with the lack of information we have, to try to better understand and make sense of our parents' stories, or caregiver stories, even if there's some limitations to that. Um, so that's a little bit of intergenerational trauma. What I also want to bring up that I think is different, though, in a lot of conversations about trauma is actually something called post-traumatic growth. And that's less spoken about, but I think just as important as we all talk about it, because when a lot of minoritized people talk about mental health, immediately we go to trauma, which makes sense because we've experienced and endured and survived a lot of it. But it's not all pain. There's also a lot to celebrate within our communities and to be proud of, and a lot of strength that comes from our communities. And so, our ability, especially like second, third gen, right? Like the folks who are somewhat acculturated in a way our parents are not, um, we have the ability to like build bridges and code switch and communicate to people. A lot of us are hypersensitive. A lot of us are empathic. A lot of us can like read body language really well and read the room because we had to, right, to translate things for our parents and ourselves. So there's a lot of strength that comes from, what we've also experienced and what we also carry. It's not all burdens. Some of it can be heirlooms. I just want to make sure that we're leaving space, an expansive space for that too. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And oh yeah, I was like a little bit curious when you were talking about communication. I was wondering what that communication was kind of like with your parents. Like, were they
Mm.
willing to share their story kind of, or were you more raised in an environment where it was like stifled?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think that's probably another one of the many reasons I wanted to be a therapist, but it is also to just sort of make sense and sort of heal my own own wounds. We as therapists have a phrase in our industry called the wounded healer that so often many of us are coming to this work not just for other people, but often for ourselves because it's a relational type of work. But going back to your point. Yeah, anytime I tried to probe, tried to get to know maybe a more tender and sort of, you know, maybe wounded, to use that word again, side of my mom, for example, she would just kind of she would kind of shut down. And I think it was out of sort of pain. Of course, that's all me just sort of speculating. But I share that to say, even if you try and you don't receive the kind of answers you want, I think there's some empathy and connection that can still come from what you observe. Again, it doesn't all have to be sort of wrapped up in a nice story. It can be like, yeah, I can read between the lines and see that my mom went through a lot, and through that, it helps me better understand why she thinks and loves the way she does. And through that, I can have some empathy, right, for what she can do and what feels limiting, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So kind of like in that vein, how do you think we should kind of like break or heal these cycles of intergenerational trauma? And maybe what have you found to be effective when dealing with families?
Yeah. So it sounds cheesy, but I would first say it starts with you, right? I think the fact that you already have some of the language, if not more, because I know this is a short conversation, but you've already you're active in sort of that micro learning that you do when you're online or you're reading the memoirs or you're trying to better understand and relate to emotional content and kind of build that emotional literacy. I think that's going to be important for you. So I think it starts with you because those are choices that often, as I said earlier, our parents or caregivers do not and did not have. And so our ability to access that information and those resources is really important. I personally, and I'm biased, but I don't think you need to access therapy when something is entirely wrong or a crisis. In fact, I think it's great to access therapy when things are going well, too. If anything, just to create sort of a preventative sort of measure around sort of when things, to build up your coping skills or to, feel like you have someone that you have a relationship with outside of your friends and family that you can uniquely speak with about these things is really, can be really cathartic. So, in addition to all the free and wonderful resources there are out now to, you know, build a literacy around mental health content, I think, and even understand what intergenerational trauma is. Like, again, like I didn't have any of that growing up. And so I think that exposure is great. And I think trying therapy, I'll also add that, not every therapist is created equal. It's okay to not vibe with your therapist when you first meet them. Try other therapists. It's okay. It's okay to try other therapists. I think sometimes people feel locked into them, even if they don't feel like there's progress. So I encourage that. And then once you feel solid in that, this is where trying to have balance and perspective when you engage with your parents and what common ground or commonalities can you relate with? Because your parents may not be all things to you in the sense that as much as you want to talk about certain things, maybe it does feel quite off limits, in which case, do you have other people? Have you built out your network of other people in your life where you can share those things with? I know well, I shouldn't say we all, but I know a lot of people have this idea or this version of their parents in which they can share and express everything openly. And it's a really lovely idea. And I think some people do have those parents. But I think so many of us feel like we have to hide certain parts of ourselves, or not share everything because we're concerned about what the other person may think or feel. And often we're trying to protect our parents, right? We're trying because it's out of love. In the same way they try to protect us. So as long as we have this spoken or unspoken understanding that it's all out of love, I think we can really find ways to build bridges um, and to find gratitude in the sacrifices our parents and caregivers so lovingly remind us that they have constantly done to help us, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know how you talked about how like some like topics like aren't like as open to parents. So like I know mental health is one of like the topics where it's more touchy around, especially Asian families. So I was wondering if you have any like thoughts or opinions on why that is. Like how did mental health or like therapy became such a touchy subject around Asian families?
Yeah, I think it actually is related to a concept you all probably know really well, which is saving face. I think there's a lot of us, and for listeners who don't who have heard that for the first time now, what that essentially means is how are we preserving sort of outward appearances to other people or outsiders not within our family unit or within our relationships. And there's a lot of social capital placed on that, right? We want to make sure that we're saving face so that we don't look, it's protective, right? It's a survival protective mechanism. So we don't look poorly or different or that we are targeted or have any sort of discrimination against us. So again, it's not coming from a bad place, but it can get in the way. Um, and so I do think when it comes to parents engaging in therapy, um, they're concerned that their child or whomever adult child is talking about them in sort of a negative light, and especially because the therapist is an outsider, right? Even if you're of the same culture, right? It's still unusual to speak to someone outside of your family. It's actually better to just not speak about it at all and sort of secret keep than it is to air quote unquote dirty laundry. And I think that can feel like it feels unsafe. It feels like a betrayal a little bit to family, or at least to a parent. It can feel that way. It can feel really unusual for a child or adult to do that. Um, so that's one of the reasons. And then I will say some of it is, from a social justice perspective, I think a lot of minoritized people, rightly so, are a little cautious around medical professionals, people of authority, because they haven't been treated well or they've been discriminated against or their needs haven't been fully met. And so sometimes there's a kind of a distrust towards outsiders and people in authority because of past trauma, right? Is it fair? No, but I can understand where it comes from. Yeah.
What I was saying is that I think when you were bringing up the concept of saving face, that it was really significant because I think it relates to a lot of the academic pressure that Asian youth experience, especially like that career pressure, for example, like you have to go to a good college or you have to become something highly respected, like a doctor or engineer. And it also makes them very like hung up on perfectionism and stuff. So I was wondering, since we go to like a fairly competitive high school, what are some signs that like academic stress is becoming harmful to youth, and how should like families or students deal with that?
Yes. So the ways that I've often seen this actually have a lot more to do what therapists call as sort of physical manifestations of stress. So, and I'm going to get really detailed here, just so if listeners hear this, maybe they can relate to some of these examples. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, and this doesn't mean that you can't have all or none of these things, but the way I usually see this come out is through compulsive behavior. So, say, you pick at your nails or bite your nails, you pull your hair, so like kind of restless kind of behavior or tics sometimes people get when they're super stressed. Of course, panic attacks can be a very common one as well, and those are very painful. It can come out of nowhere and it can feel like a heart attack, really, as people have described it. It's very hard to breathe. So there's that. If you're not feeling heightened anxiety, you can immediately plummet actually into severe depression, right? So this idea that this kind of lack of energy, the things that you used to love aren't bringing you joy anymore, a disconnection you feel to your body and to other people, heightened, criticism that's happening. And so the really insidious thing about all of this is that all those things are happening internally, which means unless you have a trained eye, unless you're close to your friend, unless you have a baseline of something's off, people do a really good job, especially perfectionists, hiding it, right? You can still highly function even when you are suffering. And it's that sort of like model minority myth. And that's another phrase that our communities often hear and again, I'll define it for those listening who have never heard it before, but really is this, I'm going to make it quick, but is essentially this phenomenon and really a really harmful stereotype that happens amongst collectively Asian people in which they um, are seen as people who are already um, high achieving and goal oriented and the model of all the minorities. And again, I promise not to get too in the weeds, but essentially the model minority has been used to be weaponized other against other folks of minoritized backgrounds. So that means someone in power, a majority group in power can say, look at these wonderful Asian people. They're doing the best, you're not. And it really pins other groups against one another. But how it affects us personally is that it creates a lot of silence, right? If we internalize that and believe, yes, we are, there's something about we take pride in being the model, for example, we can we can feel like, well, I'm going to break the facade, if you will, of performing well. And I'm no longer, right? I can't suffer. That goes against the identity of being a model, right? And so there's many ways in which that is very harmful. But going back to what you're saying, I think that's the scary part is that a lot of people experience really high stress. Like those high performers in your school can be suffering in silence. And so it really takes someone opening the door and providing some permission and perhaps even just sort of modeling vulnerability to say, hey, how'd you sleep, right? Or, how was your sleep last night? Or what'd you really think, right? Tell me how you really feel. Emphasis on the really, because I think the first conditioned response is always to be like, oh, fine, we're good, right? And like to keep it moving. And so the same advice I just shared there applies to adults. So I hope maybe adults will be listening to this, their parents will be listening to this, and they'll step back to be a little more curious about what's going on for the person they love, right? And what they're physically going through, because our bodies will often be the first signal to stress before our mind catches up because our mind can rationalize all sorts of things. We could be like, oh, it's normal, or oh, it'll go away, or oh, we can talk ourselves out of our emotions, but our body, we can't hide from it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was really well spoken. So I was like really curious, how do you think, since it's a lot of it is internal, how do you think people dealing with kind of like this stress can kind of like cope from it or deal with it in a healthier way?
Yeah. So baby steps. This is going to sound really silly, but it's often those first things. We do a lot of things. We don't do a lot of things we think are good for us. For example, we all know that we should probably eat a little more healthy. Do I personally do that all the time? No. Am I dehydrated right now? Yeah, probably. Right? Like it's those things. But here's the number one mental health determinant. It's actually sleep.
Hmm.
So it's not groundbreaking. It's not like brand new advice, groundbreaking advice. But if you had to pick anything that you could possibly work on to make you feel better, it will be focusing on getting consistent sleep. And it actually has less to do with the amount of hours, right? Because it's quality over quantity. So it actually has less to do with the hours and has more to do with going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. Just start there, which is actually a lot harder than you think it is.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Like personally, like I just like I prioritize like sleep over like my academics.
That's what I'm saying, though, right? But you know what? That helps. So sleep, it helps us against, it helps with emotional regulation, right? It helps us with cognitive processing, right? So it does help with a lot of things. Now, if you feel like you got that down pack and you're listening, like, check, check, I got it, what's next? Then I would actually start focusing on like, how many people in my life am I actually being real with? How many people do I feel like I can call and I can just show up in whatever version I am and really be. And if part of you is listening to this and is like, "Oh, I don't know if I have that person yet." Maybe start there, you know?
Yeah, so what advice would you give to like make someone like start like opening up and like be like more real about their mental health and to not be like misunderstood?
Because I feel like a lot of people might be like afraid of like judgment.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think it actually isn't about avoiding judgment. I think as humans, our natural inclination is to make judgments. It's like how we survive. It's an adaptable response. So it actually is less about avoiding judgment. It will happen, but it's actually more about if there is judgment or you sense judgment, how do you begin to broach that, right, with someone, right? How do you bring that up to say, actually, I don't think you actually get it yet. This is what I actually mean. Or that's not what I really meant. This is what I really meant, right? Finding language to be in control of your own narrative rather than someone else's judgments is going to be it's a skill, but it's a learnable skill. And so I think the more conversations you have around that, the better. I think from a therapist perspective, if judgment or the fear of judgment is what's ultimately getting in the way of opening up, I would really want to better explore where you feel that comes from, right? Like what is what are we actually afraid of? If someone misunderstands you, then what? What does that say about you? That you're what, right? Like, what is it
Mhm.
really? And that's what you will focus on trying to resolve and challenge, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely really true. Like changing your own mindset. Like that's kind of like the switch because like other people can tell you all they want, but at the end of the day, it's like you. So,
Yeah, yeah. And like people listening, it's not to say that judgments don't hurt. Obviously they do, and it can feel really rejecting to have someone you feel close with kind of misunderstand or fumble the ball. But this is where I think if the relationship is important to you, to really try to repair and lean in and kind of work to give someone the benefit of the doubt, better off, right? Than saying, that's it, confirmation bias, I'm never sharing again. I knew it was going to happen because how does that actually serve you? I don't think it does. Yeah.
yeah, that's really true.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that that's like a really positive and kind of like more inspirational note to end off our episode on. So again, thank you so much for joining us on this episode, and we really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I hope you all keep in touch and best of luck. And this was so fun. Thank you for inviting me and listening. You all are great listeners, great questions. And yeah, keep in touch if you ever need anything. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much.